So, everybody ready? Without further ado, I'm going to hand you over to Paul Chudleigh. Paul is a principal business psychologist and certified practitioner in applied neuroscience. He's a wealth of experience in the field of executive and team coaching, leadership development, and resilience building. Paul works with chief executives, directors, and managers at all levels in the public, private, and third sectors, and is a resilience at work specialist, training people in the UK and beyond to apply the tools and techniques to thrive in the challenges of the modern world of work. So we really appreciate Paul joining us today to share with us that scientific case for wellbeing in our organisations. And please feel free to use the chat, and Paul will be inviting questions. So I'll hand over to Paul. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Suzanne, and thank you for inviting me to join you here today. Good morning to everyone. It's a real honour and a privilege actually to be here supporting organisations that have done so much for us over the past year. May I extend my gratitude and a huge thanks to everybody for the fantastic work that you and your colleagues have been doing. Now, before I get into the flow of the presentation itself, I'm sure that on seeing the photograph in the programme and seeing me on screen this morning, many of you must be thinking, how could someone so young, so free of the grey hairs of experience, what could they have to share with us? Well, may I offer the assurance that I have been working in organisations for more than 30 years. And if you're thinking, well, surely that can't be the case looking at him, I was indeed a child genius and started work aged 5. So I hope that makes everything nice and clear for you. Now, I've been asked to share some thoughts with you about the science that suggests very strongly that we need to recognise the unprecedented states of organisations in the current age. And by unprecedented, I don't mean the ubiquitous use of the term in relation to COVID. I mean in relation to the pre-existing organisational complexities that we have never before encountered in human history. We're in some uncharted territories with the complexity of our organisations. Now, I'm a business psychologist, as Suzanne mentioned, and have worked with organisations large and small, and my journeys have taken me into organisations like the NHS, local government, British Airways, Oxford University, Siemens, Airbus, Selfridges, McDonald's, and lots of social purpose organisations. And of course, each has its own unique challenges, but there are very similar problems, albeit they might be dressed or labelled in different ways. So the purpose of me talking to you today is to really be clear about why we should feel empowered, we should feel confident and assured about promoting the critical nature of well-being in organisations. And I really do think that we should. What I'm going to do on our journey today is to fuel your energy and your passion by explaining, one, why I think now is the right time to pursue the well-being agenda with some gusto, why we need to try and melt away a myth that makes us sometimes doubt ourselves and the power of the work that we do in this space. And I'm also going to look at the science, or at least some of the science, that supports the well-being perspective in terms of achieving sustainable high performance, generating deeper engagement in our organizations, and actually just looking at the sheer ethics in terms of approach to work in a world where I think many of us would recognize that our jobs can very easily eat us alive. So, why might now be a good time to be promoting the very real need to take care of the people who are taking care of our patients and customers? Well, clearly COVID has been a very dark cloud that has brought with it unspeakable tragedies, as Suzanne was speaking to. And given the scale of that crisis, it might seem a little bit trite in some ways to look for silver linings. But I actually think in some ways it would be wrong not to try and carve something good out of what has happened, to learn some deeper lessons and to make some changes that last. One of the things that has emerged in my experience has been a little bit of rehumanization of work, where people are beginning to see each other not as job titles, grades, or colleagues, but to see each other as fully human. And by that, I mean brilliant, dedicated, talented, but also vulnerable and imperfect. We're beginning, hopefully, to see each other as family members, as loved ones, as people with hearts and lives outside of their work. And certainly one of the best moments of 2021 for me came in the middle of quite a serious workshop with senior leaders, which was focusing on navigating challenging conversations with people. And as we worked together on screen, a small young girl's head, aged about 6, appeared in the corner of a senior manager's screen, a beaming smile across her face. And seeing our curious faces looking back at her, she proudly lifted and displayed a freshly drawn picture of a My Little Pony. Now, such was the warmth of the feedback that she received from the group, which was very spontaneous, I have to say. She returned 10 minutes later with another masterpiece and got a very similar warmth of response. And actually, that wasn't just okay, it was great. And in the life of this senior manager, we suddenly saw there's a whole new aspect to someone who turns up at work on a weekly basis looking pretty serious about stuff. Now, the truth is, we're wired to be at our best as human beings when we feel the warmth of positive social interactions around us. And when we're seen for all that we are, in that cute instance, a loving father, and that feels okay to everyone, we're in a position where we have a route to bring in our whole self to work, which is what we're constantly talking about these days. So perhaps we're now in a time where leaders are beginning to ask themselves if it is possible to do well and do good. To look at the fact that can we perform strongly whilst keeping the people entrusted to my care, which is of course what leadership is, keeping them safe, healthy and well. Now, I think this lens of performance and well-being is an important one because of a very persistent and sticky myth, i.e., that you have to sacrifice well-being for performance or performance for well-being, that you can't have both, you've got to choose. Now, on the surface, some of us would kind of shoo away that idea, wouldn't we? But my observation is that while people don't want that to be true, they somehow fear deep down that it is. Even people in the HR, OD, and well-being space sometimes become aware of that doubt that they might have in themselves. And that doubt leads us to think that when push comes to shove, will the table thumpers, will the KPI junkies, and will the give me more for less crew rule the world? Are they actually right? Now, I think that some of this stems from the artifacts that were left by common management thinking from the 80s through to the noughties, that kind of only metrics matter, that what gets measured gets done. But of course, it's flawed thinking if it goes unquestioned. And unfortunately, it's kind of spread its tentacles, and people now seem to be measured on everything. Now, the original idea of metrics was focus on some key things, measure those things, and it will encourage people to do them. But by measuring everything, what we've done is begun to create organizations that is leading to a sense of overwhelm and indeed some fear in many places. Now, the presence of this myth that you have to choose between performance and well-being, and the fear that we have of kind of fully letting go of that myth, it undermines our confidence. It's the little devil that sits on our left shoulder and whispers in our ear that we're a bit of a tree hugger, we're a purveyor of the nice to-dos only, a practitioner of the peripheral or marginal importance arts, while others, they're the ones who are getting the real work done. Well, today I want to share with you why the science says that actually, if you're interested in this well-being space, you're on the right track. Your work is important and your value is multifaceted and central to organizational success. Now, before we dive into the science, I'm going to ask you to connect to the school of your own experience. I'm going to ask you to just test the value of well-being in your working life. I'm going to ask you to just in your mind, take yourself to a point in your career where you were feeling brilliantly resilient, you were firing on all cylinders, and you were full of well-being. So you were in a great place. We're on top of the mountain. I'm going to ask you just to write down when you were in that place, what were the most prominent feelings and thoughts you were having about yourself? Just going to ask you to scribble down a note or two if you don't mind. What were those prominent thoughts and feelings you were having about yourself when you were feeling full of resilience and well-being? Secondly, what were your thoughts and feelings about your organization at that time? Okay, so how did you feel about the organization that you were working for? Give yourself a note or two. And then finally, what effect did that sense of well-being have on your performance? So when you were feeling brilliantly resilient and full of well-being, what impact did that have on your performance? Now I'm going to ask you to travel along your career timeline to a slightly different place. I'm going to ask you to take yourself to a point where you felt very low in resilience, where your well-being was really wobbling and you were more in the valley than on the mountaintop. And I'm just going to ask you to respond to the same questions. What were your thoughts and feelings about yourself at that point? What were your thoughts and feelings about your organization at that point? And what kind of impact did that diminished sense of well-being have on your individual performance? And now what I'm going to ask you to do is just to contrast and compare those two lists that you've just produced. And the questions I've really asked you are, how was your well-being? How are you doing in terms of the way you were thinking? How was your engagement with your organization? How was your performance? And I'm just going to ask you to use a chat function, just briefly, if you wouldn't mind, just to describe how big is the difference. Are we talking about the length of a hair on a gnat's leg? Or are we talking a difference that's more the size of an elephant? And if you could just use the chat just to illustrate to us how big that difference is. How significant is the effect of well-being on your mental health, on your engagement, and your performance? And I think, Karen, you were going to share some of the thoughts that were coming up into the chat.
Just starting to come through now, Paul. Words like massive, massive impact across your life, worlds apart, huge, significant, huge. Yeah, very similar stuff.
Okay. Okay. So brilliant. I just saw the thought that went through about more of a horse than an elephant, but still significant.
And also not an elephant, a zoo.
Okay. Okay. So we're just kind of testing some of what happens in real life to real people like yourselves when our well-being is or isn't in a good place. So let's just explore this a little bit further to see if the science supports some of the things that you've just demonstrated through your little kind of individual case studies. Let's travel back a little bit in time to a study by Dornan and Jana Lopez, and they studied organizations across 15 countries, including the UK, 10 industry sectors, including the public sector, and eventually recorded survey data from nearly 29,000 employees. They took the data and looked for statistically significant correlations between organizations that were actively promoting health and well-being and employee perceptions and experiences of their employers. And the results were pretty startling. Well, startling if you care about your organisation being a productive, engaging and innovative place to work. It's also worth noting that the figures you see on screen here were not shared with the tree huggers and hippies of the World Unite conference, but rather they were shared with the World Economic Forum. People who are interested in growth, productivity, performance, and hard measures of success. When you begin to look at the figures on this screen, I think it shows that your work is much more than nice to do. It's actually significant in terms of organisational thriving. Now, here's some good news emerging from that silver lining that I mentioned earlier on. From a measly 58% in 2020, the CIPD survey as its professionals indicated there has been a surge in efforts to promote well-being this year. Now, at this point, I'd like to say open the beers, get the wine out, get the deck chairs out, let's enjoy the sunshine. No need for me or anybody else to speak at this conference. Hooray, cue ticker tape, confetti and marching bands. But regrettably, the respondents also noted that only 50% felt that their organisations were being effective at reducing workplace stress, and 91% of respondents knew of individuals in their organisation that had taken a stress-related leave of absence over the past year. So I'm sorry, guys, we need to put the deck chairs back in the shed for a moment or two. There is some work that we need to be getting on with. So why is it the case? What's going wrong? Why is there a gap between promoting and actually effectively managing well-being in the workplace? Well, to get some insights, we need to have a look at another part of the CIPD study. Some of the common causes of unhelpful stress in the workplace. And you'll begin to see that adapting to COVID working practices features significantly, but not quite as prominently as management style and the sheer weight of traffic that people are having to deal with. Having to be always on and never switched off also features often in surveys of this type. We can also see that relationships at work cause concern for 1 in 5 people. And these are some of the real things that begin diminishing our sense of well-being. Now, broadly speaking, there are 2 avenues that we're able to take to try and increase well-being at work. So what are they? Well, the first route is to implement strategies and tactics that offset the potentially negative effect of stresses at work. And some of these approaches can be incredibly helpful. Gym memberships, healthy eating advice, mindfulness classes, walking groups, support groups, employee assistance schemes, etc. All of these things, in essence, provide good tools, techniques and mechanisms that can be incredibly helpful. They offer psychological and physiological boosts to help us manage stressors. They, in essence, offset some of the stresses that we face. But let's just quickly remind ourselves of some of those stressors from the CIPD survey, plus those factors commonly cited as most correlated with employee burnout. Unmanageable workload, unclear communication from managers, lack of management support, unreasonable time pressures, and unfair treatment. Perhaps, rather than seeking to offset their impacts, it would be better to directly enhance working life by tackling some of them at source. A few insights to the way that our brain operates will help me to explain why this might prove particularly helpful. Let's swiftly look at 3 arguments. Let's look at 3 arguments that suggest why offsetting is great, but that going to the source and changing some of the conditions that we face might be even better. Let's look first of all from the performance perspective and just try and answer the question, why can't people just focus and get it done? I do apologize. We seem to have for some reason, having a bit of a problem with the slides that are coming up. They're not coming up in quite the right order. So apologies for that. But what I'd like you to do, if you don't mind, is just take your hand for a minute and just lay it over your forehead. Just spread your fingers as wide as you can. Just push the kind of palm of your hand just under your eyebrows there. Just spread that across. Now, this speaks to two things really, that it's amazing how mature people will do anything that a facilitator will ask them to do in the midst of a training event. So thank you very much for amusing me slightly. But there was a real reason for doing that, because roughly where you just spread your hand is your beneath where your hand was, is your prefrontal cortex, the executive center of your brain. And its operations are central to your decision making, your analysis, your evaluation, your planning, the regulation of your emotions, the matching of your actions to context, your choice of language and the means of expressing, your forecasting, your integration and meaning making of all of the signals from the different parts of your brain, such as your senses or your feelings. So in essence, it's a pretty critical piece of kit, and I very rarely leave home without mine. It's core to the conscious choices and actions that we take each day. It's also known by some neuroscientists as the Goldilocks of the brain. Conditions need to be just right for it to operate at its best. When things are too hot or too cold, it becomes unfocused, strained, scrambled, and exhausted. So what are some of the conditions that enable it to perform at its best? Well, firstly, when we have certain conditions, it makes it physiologically more difficult to access the best version of you. Some of those things that get in the way are fatigue, lack of rest, and pushing on for too long without a break. Overwhelm, having too much to do and not enough time. Ambiguity about what's really important and how I can position myself to be successful and keep myself safe from disapproval. When I feel that I don't matter or I'm not significant, where I feel that I'm being treated unfairly or there is inequity in treatment, or where I feel that there is a sense of low care, low inclusion, and low empathy. All of these things get my prefrontal cortex not working at its very best across that whole range of activities and more that I described to you earlier on. Now, let's just pause for a moment. Overwhelm, ambiguity, uncertainty about priorities, feeling that we don't matter, feeling that things are unjust, sensing we're in a low care, low empathy environment. These factors are commonly correlated with burnout, and long before we get there, they diminish cognitive performance. That's why we can't just expect people to perform, because we're creating conditions that actually biologically work against high performance. We're in essence planting people into, or planting into dry, barren, nutrient-free soil and wondering why the plants don't bear more fruit. So what we then do is instigate complex fruit-going metrics, ponder why we aren't growing more, and then blame the plant for its lack of effort. Now, it's worth recognizing some measurement is good, but over measurement is a sign of a culture that actually probably isn't supporting performance. If you measure too many things, it doesn't support a focus on priorities, which was what the whole measurement industry was about. Instead, it creates anxiety about having to cover too many bases, and it leaves us constantly feeling on the brink of being in trouble. Jeffrey Pfeffer from Stanford University said it like this: people feel that they are always being assessed and evaluated, that there is less forgiveness in our work cultures and not much patience or tolerance for natural fluctuations in individual job performance. A tough, judgmental, evaluating culture confronted with natural individual variations in performance is likely to punish people for uncontrollable swings in performance. Now, this fear of judgment, this fear of not being able to cover all the bases, actually hampers the performance of the prefrontal cortex, diminishes our performance, and makes lower performance more likely to happen. So, what do we do about this? Well, clearly we need to create the right conditions, those just right conditions for the prefrontal cortex, conditions that seem to be constructed to help, to nurture a sense of well-being. Where we feel that's happening, our prefrontal cortex is released to be at its best. The sense of well-being increases performance and augments our resilience, and resilience becomes the root to sustainable high performance. And perhaps we saw that from the exercise that you conducted earlier on. In essence, well-being creates high performance and keeps it there for longer. And it's worth bearing in mind that a review of 113 studies of the workplace by Schultz and Eddington some years ago concluded that there is robust evidence of a strong relationship between health in its broadest sense and productivity. So let's look at the second argument, the engagement argument. And my second argument is that cultures of well-being drive engagement. And engagement can be looked at in many different ways. Perhaps it's the degree that I care about my work and my organisation, or perhaps it's the proportion of my whole self that I bring to work. Perhaps it's about how much of my passion, time and energy that I'm pleased to bring to my work. And I'm kind of reminded of the old saying, which is all of my people are talented, energized, motivated, passionate and caring. I'm just trying to figure out how to get them to be like that at work. Now, I fundamentally believe that work could and can be a great thing in our lives. I think it's what lots of us long for. Our sense of identity, self-worth and self-confidence can be nourished by becoming great at what we do. Our need for purpose and mastery in life can come in part from our work. But I fear that in some organizations, people are engaged to a good degree with their work, their patients or their customers, despite their organizations. And that's a real tragedy because when we operate like that, it's draining, it limits deeper engagement, and it's really hard to sustain. It also affects how we turn up at work. The brain can be compared to an orchestra. Lots of individual components that when played together in different combinations create very different sounds and have very different effects on the listeners. And the components of our brain are similar. They can combine in different ways to form different systems of operation that put us in the right mode for the circumstances in which we find ourselves. Where we create environments rich in psychological safety, when we sense we're trusted, we're cared for, we're protected, we're encouraged to be well, we naturally fall into that productive mode. We feel no need to raise our defenses or fight our corner, so our cognitive and emotional bandwidth can be used to deliver our very best work. However, should my environment or culture be such that I don't feel safe enough, my brain commandeers some of those resources to protect me. I go into an amber alert mode, second guessing, being suspicious, wary, and somehow kind of a bit hunkered down as a version of me. A bit like a hedgehog primed to curl up into the protective ball, and that's our self-protective mode. Now, just look at these two modes of operation, the typical characteristics that are engendered by each of them. It's not too hard to see, is it, which ones best support true engagement. Well-being cultures nurture the physiological and psychological conditions that drive engagement and performance. And all of this is particularly important within the context of an NHS, within the context of the NHS. A couple of people have just got there. If you can just go on to chat, that would be fantastic. I think we can hear some whispers in the background. Again, just my apologies about there's just a little bit of a problem with the slides. Now, let's just have a look at why I think this stuff is really important in our NHS context. There are different ways at looking at how inherently straining jobs are in comparison with one another. Some of the measures that you can look at is how intellectually demanding are the tasks. How much work involves dealing with people in their negative emotional register, where we're dealing with people in their sadness, their pain, their fear, their anger, etc. What happens to individuals and or the organisation if people get it wrong? And how quickly must I deal with new pieces of work and how much work is there to do? So in essence, cognitive load, emotional labour, the cost of error, and the speed and weight of traffic affect how inherently stressful or draining a job can be. Now, with those factors in mind, consider the role of a cardiac consultant in a packed clinic day. Consider the work of A&E teams on a Saturday night. Consider the challenges of being in a busy community mental health team, dealing with patients with complex needs, with probably not enough resources to be able to do it. These jobs are all high in inherent job stressors. Now, as well as those inherent job stressors, we can be supported or diminished by the ambient conditions. In essence, the characteristics of the organisation we're being asked to engage with. Are those ambient conditions that we're working in ones that encourage us to bring our whole self to work? Ones that inherently offset some of those jobs demands by being supportive, by being encouraging, by recognising and trying to help us? Or do they amplify our stress and make hard work even harder? Now, if the characteristics that are most prominent in an organisation are the latter, then we can kiss a lot of engagement efforts goodbye. They won't touch the sides on the way through, because my psychological response will be to withdraw, to close down, to go into that self-protective state and hide a little bit from the organisation. Where we get the culture wrong, our brain processes the organisation as another stressor, rather than something that's offsetting the stress by the systems and processes that it creates. And that's a real shame, because we would all prefer to be engaged with our organisations. What we really want is an organisational context that supports safety, learning, not blame, empathy, not judgment, and some accountability, but with fairness and balance. A culture, a genuine culture of well-being that we truly want to engage with, because it understands the inherent stresses of our job and it seeks to appreciate and account for them. Where our organisations feel like they are committed to helping us, we go gently into that productive state, the mode that we really want to be in. So, excuse me for the slight problems we're having with the slides here. I hope that just so far, this exploration of performance and engagement science is proving at least a little bit compelling. Well, let's add one more ingredient to the mix, which is the ethical argument. It's good to know, isn't it, that we no longer send small children into mechanical looms, deeming the loss of a finger or two fair game if we are to keep the wheels of productivity moving on. Well, at least my local health board tells me that they don't do that anymore. We also tend not to pay our staff half a shilling a year for their talents or efforts, but we do have some new ethical challenges that we have to embrace. Geoffrey Pfeffer, as I mentioned earlier on, undertook and reviewed a whole range of studies prior to writing what I thought was a very eye-opening text, Dying for a Paycheck. His research concluded that toxic workplaces are the 5th leading cause of mortality in the United States. Now, some of the conditions that are applicable in the US aren't quite as relevant here, but his assertion that poor psychological conditions create physiological distress and mortality does hold true. A study by the Mayo Clinic in the US indicates that the person that you report to at work is more important for your health than your family doctor. And that might be in ways good or bad. An independent study by the Karolinska Institute found that working for a poor leader increases your risk of serious cardiovascular disease by 24% over baseline in the population. Stay under that leadership for 4 years or more, and it jumps to 39% over baseline. In essence, what I'm trying to say to you is cultures that ignore well-being hurt people. Pfeffer notes that studies constantly demonstrate the connection between workplace-induced stress and unhealthy behaviours such as overeating, alcohol consumption, smoking, and drug abuse. So I want you to know that the work that you're doing matters. It really matters. Because what you are doing, in essence, by focusing on the well-being agenda, is to help build sustainable performance to benefit the populations you serve. That you can boost engagement with your organisation by shaping practices that make people want to engage and also create the psychological conditions that enable us to engage. And actually, fundamentally, your work can help keep dedicated people alive and well, thriving in their work and nourished by their pride in the personal and collaborative alignment to do good in the world. So please do continue your work, offset, help and support as much as you can, but also try to tackle at source, reduce the actual stresses or manage them in a way that reduces the stress load on individuals and their well-being. There are answers. They're out there and organisations are doing it at the moment to what might seem like insoluble or formidable problems, but we can find the answers just by being honest, fixing our attention on them long enough, appreciating just how incredibly important they are so that we can find the fixes. I hope the conference goes some way to helping you to develop some of those specific solutions over the next few days. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Paul, and it's Karen here. I feel so energised by what you said then, and the message I'm taking from that is about, now's not the time to take your foot off the brake. There can be a school of thought to say, there's a lot of wellbeing offers out there, and it almost becomes a little bit of white noise. But such a strong business case, an evidence-based business case there for continuing to do what we're doing and translating that back into what we're role modelling in the workplace. We've literally just got a couple of minutes for questions. If one or two of you would like to put any questions to Paul. A couple of comments that I've written down throughout the session is that there is a significant impact on performance when well-being's low. Retention is an issue, especially for people later in their careers. And when well-being's not there and people aren't being supported, it can really impact on retention. This whole piece about achieving targets taking over still, even when people resilience levels are not necessarily high. One comment about your hug on the head, that it's better than banging your head against a brick wall. So you might have started to create a movement there. Being part of a supportive team is vital. We could talk for a long time about technology and how that affects our confidence and stress levels. And there's a couple of comments there about that. So those are some of those things. Just having a quick look to see if there's any particular questions. Just some really positive feedback around excellent talk, really thought-provoking. From Amanda, also important for leaders to protect themselves and consider their own well-being, and that's why we're here, isn't it, as leaders, to role model. So some really positive comments there. If any of you have struggled with the slides, I think we've done, we're keeping our fingers crossed, we've done well. Most of us are all still here over the last half an hour. The slides look really impressive, Paul, even though you have to flick backwards and forwards. So we'll definitely share those and make sure everybody gets those. So thanks so much, Paul, for that.